Life is a continuous process in which all the living beings, including ourselves, are continuously adapting to changing environmental conditions in order to survive and perpetuate their species. We humans should permanently keep our minds open and always learn something new, for this is the way we adapt best. This is the second of two videos where we talk about some tips that the COVID-19 crisis is offering us about the challenges of the future. In the first video, linked in the description below, we presented some things that we should have known already before the pandemic and which the pandemic made more obvious. In this video, we will talk about some of the lessons we would have to learn once the pandemic is over, in order to avoid repeating some of the mistakes that brought us here. We have to understand humans as a single race, the human race. We are all alike, and this COVID-19 pandemic have shown that whatever happens to one of us can happen to any of us, regardless the color of our skin, our place of birth, or our religious beliefs. We have a lot more in common than differences. Nevertheless, the differences between us exist, and they are not at all based on the color of our skin, but very much on education and knowledge inequalities that our way of life created. Therefore, they must be understood, treated with care, and definitely not ignored. This crisis showed us, like a mirror, how varied these levels of education are around the world, how big the gaps between these levels are, and how ignoring them can become very dangerous. From healthcare to teaching, from science to food, everything evolved extremely fast in the last couple of decades and accelerated during the 2020 pandemic. As a consequence, the generations gap, the gap between parents and their children, even though it has always been present, it widened more than ever before. Likewise, the gap between the present and the future of technology, medicine, or education, the gap between the present and the future of our species is today inconceivably huge. Now more than ever seems to be the time for new missionaries. The missionaries of science, not school teachers, but teachers, wandering not much on land but very much on the virtual space. These new missionaries should help people in need understand the increasingly complicated truth of today, teaching them how not to fall victims of falsehoods and misinformation. This pandemic might have seemed surprising for some, but it was not. We humans have encountered quite a few contagious viruses in the past few decades only. HIV, SARS-CoV, H1N1, MERS-CoV, or Ebola. So there are chances that we will encounter more in the future, even in the very near future. That because we created the perfect environment for viruses to rapidly evolve and adapt to humans. In short, like any other form of life, viruses manifest genetic variations to our so-called industrial ways of exploiting other animal species. We force thousands or tens of thousands of individuals live bunched together, and therefore it became extremely easy for viruses to jump from one host to another. So the more hosts visited, more individual viruses are born, more individuals, more genetic variations, so a faster evolution, and therefore more chances to produce the variation adapted to humans. Speaking about after the pandemic, we cannot not to ask ourselves if there will be an afterwards, if this pandemic will ever be over. We cannot forget that viruses can interbreed, so the risk of facing a more lethal virus one that could put our species in an even greater danger, is today higher than ever. Having all this in mind, trying to find new drugs or vaccines for a cure might not be the solution. We are already addicted to drugs breed for health and for sickness. From birth to death, we take pills or injections for almost everything, almost all the time. But while this way of life might make a good movie, it makes a very poor real life. The continuously increasing use of drugs might not really help us in the long run. It might actually do the exact opposite. We should consider fundamental changes in our behavior. First of all, we may want to change our bad habits and our decision-making processes by dealing with the causes in the first place and not only trying to find a magic pill against the effects of those causes. Eating pills from dawn to dusk will never transform humans into a highly processed chemicals eaters. We saw once more through this pandemic how technology is a double-edged sword. It can be used for good or bad with the same ease. As a way of example, while many apps helped people understand the COVID-19 dangers or helped them avoid areas with high risk of infection, many other apps helped spreading conspiracy theories and falsehoods, worsening the effects of the pandemic. Cooperation has always been and always will be the better way to deal with problems, especially with global problems like climate change, or disruptive technologies, or a pandemic. If nations will continue to compete against each other, we risk to engage in a race that has only losers and no winner. Blaming the guilty will never bring a solution. On the contrary, collaboration between those involved, the solvers as well as the guilty, is always the best way to find a solution.